The judicial branch, Article 3 of the Constitution. You'll notice that Article 3, of the three articles that describe the three branches of government, Article 3 is the shortest. In fact, most of Article 3 is about what kind of cases can go to the Supreme Court. And there's some legal definitions in there about treason, for instance. So we're not going to cover a lot of that, what kind of cases can go to the Supreme Court. I think that's much more for a high school class or even college class. We're going to focus on more the nuts and bolts of the judicial branch in terms of what it does, how that works, but not such what cases go. Now, I think at this point, everyone should know what the judicial branch does. We know that the legislative branch makes laws. We know that the executive branch enforces those laws. And very often, what we're taught is that the purpose of this branch is to interpret laws. Now, what does interpret mean? And I've said this more than once, but I think it bears saying again. When you get accused of a crime and you go to court, the court is saying, you violated thus and such law by doing whatever the thing is that you did. And when they make that claim, what they're really doing is they're saying, we're looking at this law and we think that what you did was a violation of that law. That is a matter of interpretation. And this is what courts do all the time. Someone's claimed that you've broken the law and then therefore you should be punished. And the question is what you did a violation of the law? Now, consider this. The judicial branch is part of the federal government, and in order to get into the judicial branch and have your case interpreted, you're going to have to break a federal law. Keep that in mind. These are images that are commonly associated with the branch we call the judicial branch. The building itself, which you saw in the previous picture, is the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. The outside of the building is primarily white marble. And so you can see here in both of these statues that there is a lot of white marble outside. This person, in fact, is Moses from the Old Testament. And these are the 10 Commandments. Okay, there wouldn't be 10 on each tablet, but there'd be 5 on one and 5 on the other. And he's considered the first lawgiver. And in fact, a lot of our laws in this country, the basis of them is what we would call Judeo-Christian belief. In other words, they come out of the Bible. Issues, for instance, of murder. Okay, these are things that can be traced right back to the 10 Commandments. Now, in stark contrast to that, the interior of the judicial branch is this deep red color, right? And I think what's most important is, in fact, this statue you see here, which is at the top of the Supreme Court building. And this is what we very often will refer to as Lady Justice. And Lady Justice has this name because Lady Justice is a symbol of justice. In a courtroom, we weigh the evidence. In a courtroom, justice is to be blind. We don't look at, for instance, how wealthy a person is. We don't look at whether they're male or female. We don't look at, their race. None of these things are considered. Justice is blind. But most importantly, remember, justice will end up with bad guys being punished and the good guys going free. And so justice is able to punish those who break the law, that there is a consequence to violating the law. It's important to realize that Article 3 isn't just about this thing called the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, one of the powers that is given to Congress and is also mentioned in Article 3 is to set up courts that are inferior to the Supreme Court. And it's important to understand what it means to be inferior. It means lower, less than, okay? Not as powerful, not the final say. Okay, those courts that are inferior to the Supreme Court or lower than the Supreme Court are called federal courts. There are a lot of federal courts, okay? And I think it's safe to say 100 or more federal courts in the country, there's only one Supreme Court. All the members of the federal judiciary, in other words, all these people that are in these things called federal courts, okay? They're called justices. They are appointed by the President of the United States, and then they are approved by the Senate. This happens with a simple majority vote. This is one of the three main areas where the Senate has to do an approval of an appointment by the president. Remember, the other two are ambassadors and cabinet members. Now, if you look at Article 3, Section 1, you're going to find in that first section, and it's a short paragraph, there's some important information about the qualifications for being a judge and what the term for their being a member is. How long do they get to serve as a federal judge? And then lastly, how is it they can be removed, which is not something that is plainly stated in Article 3, but is more so stated in Article 1 of the Constitution. So I'm going to read to you from Article 3, Section 1, and it says, "The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress from time to time shall ordain and establish." So the Congress sets up those lower courts, those federal courts. "And they shall hold their offices during good behavior." So those justices or judges, they shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services compensation. They get paid, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office, which means if they start off making $100 a week, they will always make at least $100 a week for as long as they're a judge. It never goes down, is the idea. So the question is, when you read Article 3, Section 1, what are the qualifications for being a judge? Did you hear any qualifications in there at all? And if you read it over, the answer should be no. There aren't any. The only qualification for being a judge is that you have to be appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. That's it. There's no requirement for education. There's no requirement for being a judge somewhere else, or even being a lawyer, for instance. There's just simply that you have to get appointed and approved. Now, how long do they serve? And what it says there is kind of interesting. It says that they shall serve, they shall hold their office during good behavior. And so their term is kind of strangely described as their term lasts as long as they are well behaved. Well, then this kind of begs a few questions. First of all, what does it mean to be well behaved? And second of all, who decides if they're not well behaved? And then who removes them from office if they're not well behaved? Well, the removal from office happens to work the same way as it does for president. And so they can be impeached, which means they have to go through that process where they are accused by the House and then found guilty by the Senate and then removed from office. That is the process. But unlike the president who can get impeached for any crime he may commit or she may commit, the removal of a judge from federal office, from his appointment as a federal judge, this happens just because the House says, "Oh, he did a bad thing. He misbehaved." And the Senate says, "Yep, that is a bad thing." And they vote and they convict him. And the result is he's removed from office. Now, you can only imagine that what is bad has changed over time. What we consider bad today may have been considered, most likely would have been considered horrible at the time. And what is bad then, we would look at it today and go, that ain't such a big deal. And I think a good example of this is the first federal judge ever to be removed from office was actually found at home drunk by a member of the House of Representatives. And as a result, he told the other members of the House, they impeached him, accused him, and then the Senate put him on trial, found him guilty of being drunk at home, and removed him from office. So I guess being drunk at home back then was really bad behavior. Today we go, well, that's kind of socially responsible. If you're going to drink and drink too much, you should drink at home where you aren't going to hurt somebody, most likely. The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court members are the ones that are referred to as justices. And that's a majority of the people that are there. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court. One of them is actually called the Chief Justice, and the Chief Justice is the person who is the head of the Supreme Court. The Chief Justice does things like, for instance, set the calendar, determines what cases are going to be heard in what order. He gives assignments. So, for instance, there are certain responsibilities that need to be taken care of by the members of the courts, and so he gives those assignments to different members of the court. Now, this picture is old. All right, so currently these are not the members of the Supreme Court, although this man is, in fact, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court right now. So how is it you get to the Supreme Court? Well, there's 2 different ways of doing this. And we're going to talk about the federal court path first. And that is, how do you get there by, violating a federal law? And that is the first thing you need to remember, is that to get to the Supreme Court here, you're going to have to violate a federal law. It has to be a violation of federal law, or in other words, a crime. Okay, that's a federal crime. And you're going to get sent, let's say it's bank robbery, and you're going to get sent to a U.S. district court. And in that U.S. district court, they're going to put you on trial. Now, the thing is about trial in a federal court is you get to choose between whether you want a judge or a jury. So you don't get that choice in other courts, but in federal courts you do. Now, let's say that you don't like the decision made by the U.S. District Court, then you can appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals. It's important to recognize what the word appeal means. Appeal is not just asking, okay? An appeal really is more of a pleading. Please hear my case again. The thing is, the U.S. Court of Appeals can reject your appeal. They don't have to take it. If they think that they did a good job down here in the district court, then they can say, well, then their decision stands, right? You're not going to get heard in our court. Now, if you get into the U.S. District Court, U.S. Court of Appeals, and you feel like your voice wasn't heard here, let's say you feel like your rights were violated, not all the evidence was looked at, you can also appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And when you appeal to that court, the same process, they can reject it or they can accept it. It's important to recognize that there are hundreds of cases that are requested to be heard by the Supreme Court, and typically every year only between 50 and 60 cases actually are heard. And this whole process going through the federal court system, this whole process is not fast. This whole process can take as much as 5 years. It's a very crowded system. Now, is that the only way to get there? And the answer is absolutely no. What if you commit a state crime? Let's say you rob 7-Eleven. Then you're going to go to what's called a state trial court. And if you feel like you weren't treated fairly there, you could always appeal to the state appellate court. And if you feel like you weren't treated fairly there, you could always appeal to the state Supreme Court. And if you feel like you weren't treated fairly there, you could always appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. But when you are in the state system, the only way you get to appeal from the state Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court is if you have a case that is a constitutional issue. Now, what does that mean? The most common example would be that you have a case that actually involves the violation of your rights found in the Bill of Rights. If that's the case, then you can always appeal to the Supreme Court. If not, you can't, and the state Supreme Court will have the last say. Now, it's important to note that when you get to the U.S. Supreme Court, whatever they decide, whether they decide not to hear your case, in which case the appellate court here or the state Supreme Court here, their decision stands. But notice this: there's no way to go any higher than the Supreme Court. There's no world court. There's no North American court. It is the highest court in the land. It is the last say. That's as far as it goes. Now, the last idea we're going to talk about with regards to the judicial branch is this thing called judicial review. And this is not something that's found in the Constitution. It's kind of important to recognize that. As a matter of fact, how it happened was somewhat controversial at the time. Sometimes the Congress, sometimes the president, they get overzealous. And what does that mean, overzealous? Well, they get impatient. It's not happening fast enough. So they want things to happen faster. And sometimes when you're doing things fast, you get careless. And so what they end up doing is they create laws or they do something. They act in some way. That's what the president would do. He doesn't make laws. He would act in some way. And what they're doing is a violation of the Constitution. Their action or the law they make is a violation of the Constitution. What does that mean? Well, what the Constitution says is you can't do that thing. And yet they did it anyways. Now, this happened for the very first time that we know of, only because there was a Supreme Court case about it. You could probably make the argument that it happened before this time. But it happened for the very first time in 1803 when William Marbury sued the Secretary of State at the time, James Madison. This was before James Madison was president. Now, you need to listen to the story because it's not going to make sense if you don't listen. But in 1796, John Adams is president. John Adams is a Federalist. That's his political party. His vice president is, in fact, Thomas Jefferson, good old TJ, and TJ is what's known as a Democratic Republican. In 1800, in the election of 1800, it's John Adams versus Thomas Jefferson. That's right. The vice president tries to take the president's job. And right before John Adams, right before the election of 1800, after the election of 1800, and right before Thomas Jefferson takes office, John Adams went forward and he appointed dozens of, and here's the important thing, they're Federalist judges. Dozens of Federalist judges. Not federal judges, just federal judges. Yes, they are federal judges, but they are Federalists. They are not part of Thomas Jefferson's party. Those judges all go and they get approved by the Senate. And when the Senate then turns around and tries to send them back to the president, John Adams is no longer the president. Thomas Jefferson is, and he's a Democratic Republican. And so what happens is that Thomas Jefferson, as the Democratic Republican, he rejects the appointments. He tells his Secretary of State, who is James Madison, he tells James Madison, you send those things back to the Senate and you tell them we reject these appointments. Why? Because they're all a bunch of Federalists. I don't trust these people. Well, Mr. William Marbury was one of those judges. He got approved by the Senate, and it was sent off to the president, and Thomas Jefferson rejected it. James Madison sent them back. So what Mr. Marbury says, I'm suing Mr. Madison. I should have had a job. I got appointed, and I got approved. Why haven't I got a job? Mr. Marbury takes his case directly to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court asks him a question. What is it that you think is about your case? What it is about your case that you think allows you to go directly to the Supreme Court? And he says, well, it's not necessarily something in the Constitution. It is something in a law that was written. And this law is known as the Judiciary Act. And he says that law allows me to go right to the Supreme Court to sue Mr. Madison. And the Supreme Court says, well, that's interesting because in the Constitution doesn't say that. The Constitution gives a whole lot of other ways in which you can go right to the Supreme Court. But when one person is suing another person in government, that is not one of the ways. And so the Supreme Court asks themselves a question. Which do we listen to? Do we listen to a federal law, or do we listen to the Constitution of the United States? Which one is superior? Which one is more powerful? Which one is the one that we should follow? And for the first time in the history of the United States, the Supreme Court, a federal court, decides that any law or government action that violates or contradicts the Constitution, this is important, that it violates or it violates or contradicts the Constitution, can be declared unconstitutional. And why do they say this is true? And they said this because in Article 6 of the Constitution describes the Constitution. That's right, the Constitution describes the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. And they ask themselves this question: how can the Constitution be the supreme law of the land if any law written by Congress can contradict it? And the answer is it can't be. To be the supreme law of the land, it has to be more powerful than any law written by Congress or anyone else for that matter. And this process of declaring things unconstitutional is what we call judicial review. And this only happens in federal courts. It does not happen in state courts. So it happens in all the district courts, the appellate courts, and it also happens in the Supreme Court. And it all started with this Supreme Court case right here, Marbury versus Madison in 1803.